Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of MC 360 week 6 on basic layout and design. In our last video, we talked about how we can create hierarchy through different composition elements. Today, we're going to be using a lot of the tricks of the trade that designers use when starting projects. I think a lot of times when you are starting out a design and you just have the blank sheet in front of you, it can often create anxiety because you don't really know exactly how to lay out the page. And I think a lot of times starting can be the most challenging part of layout and design because you really just have endless possibilities. So, how can you kind of help guide yourself through a basic layout? Well, one of the tools that are very often used are grids. Now, grids actually began because of the need of publishers in the press to line up the block letters for a printing press. Now, of course, we don't actually have to do that now, but this is the whole reason that grids were created for layout. And yet we still use grids for all different kinds of layouts, both print and digital. Here you can still see the columns and the grids. We also use them on websites. And here are some basic, website, desktop uh, templates that also use grids. So there are many different types of grids. The most common that you have probably used every day is a baseline grid. A baseline grid is just ruled paper where it gives you enough lines to be able to have even baselines for your text. And so word processing and even printed sheets of paper that you write on with ruled lines are baseline grids. This is very effective for manuscripts, books, and things of that nature. Once you get into a little more complicated design, you're going to need other kinds of grids. But even within those more complicated types of design, having baseline alignment is very important because you will always be able to tell when the alignment gets off. So it's important to keep a baseline grid even when you have other elements so that your text aligns properly. Now, columns are probably the second most common form of grid, particularly with more multimedia elements such as photos and visuals. Columns allow you to have a lot of room to play around with because you can do 4 columns of text. You can do a photo that takes over 2 columns or 3. So it's really a great way to help you kind of organize the page, but still get a lot of content on it. So here's an example of the use of columns in design. So you can see here that the most of the text lines up on 3 different columns on the page. But notice on number 30 that they have broken the column to allow 30 and its subtext to go across the different columns. So even within your grid, it's okay to break it sometimes, but it still allows you to have organization and hierarchy in your design. There are also modular grids. Not only do they have the vertical lines that column grids do, but modular grids have vertical and horizontal lines that create boxes on the page. Now, your modulars may not be as extensive as these. You can have, just 4 boxes on the page and still have a modular grid system. These are very common for layouts that involve multiple photos and a lot of different elements that you don't want structured as specifically as columns. So this gives you a lot of design room to play around with. Modular grids are also very popular for the web because, again, they allow for multimedia content to all fit together very well. Now, keep in mind that one element can go across multiple modules, but when you have that kind of square start, it allows you to play around with the size of each block and module, which is how we get a lot of our layouts for websites. Pixels are used particularly for photos. So if you are to go into Photoshop, for example, and zoom in all the way, you would see that each photo is made up of various pixels that are really just boxes of color. And so while we don't necessarily design down to the pixel, it's important to remember that most of your visual elements are going to have some pixels that you can play around with so that you can get very in-depth with your editing. But there are specific types of layout, particularly in visuals and animation, that do use pixel design. They're just not as common. So when we're talking about grids, there are a couple of definitions that we need to know. The first is a spread. A spread is two sets of pages that are meant to be viewed together. If you were to take a magazine and open it up, you're going to have the left page and the right page. Together, these make your spread. Now, a spread could be larger than that. You could have a trifold, a brochure, and so the spread would be all three pages linked together. So when you're talking about a spread, what you're really talking about is the full design as if it were laid out flat. A page within a spread is just one sheet. And of course, these sheets can be different sizes. If we're talking about a usual page, it's usually 8.5 by 11, but you could, in a trifold, for instance, have a page that was much thinner, but taller. Now, trim marks are the lines that are printed in the corner of your publication sheet that show the printer where to trim the paper, because you're actually going to print out your designs smaller than the paper's edge. This allows the printer to be more precise. And so when you're using professional printers, they're actually going to use larger pieces of paper or whatever medium you're using than what you really want. So you need to place trim marks to show your printer where your design should be cut. Trim is the final size of the print after it's been cut. Bleeds are extra parts of the layout that extend beyond the trim area of your printing piece. So you know that the bleed is not going to be shown because it's cut off. Margins are the areas between the main content of a page and the page edges. So your margin is what's considered outside your safe zone. The safe zone is the area within the cut and trim line where you can be sure that important text and graphics will not be trimmed off, even if the printer malfunctions and prints outside of its expected space. So you should always leave a little bit of margin, and then keep in mind that you're going to have a bit of bleed so that your printer can trim it off. Now, the top margin is the one that is at the top of the page to the bottom of your safe zone. And you're going to specify your margins either with a size, such as inches, or some people will use a percentage of your page or your spread to determine their margins as well. The outside margins are the margins at the outside of the pages. For your left page, it's going to be on the left side. For your right page, it's going to be on the right side. And so the outside margins are the ones that are going to border the outside of the page and stand alone. The bottom margin is the one at the bottom of the page, while the inside margins are the ones on the insides of the page where the left and the right side touch one another. On the left page, that's actually going to be on the right side, and on the right page, it's going to be on your left side. The gutter in a spread is what we call the two inside margins together. So when you're trying to measure your margins, keep in mind that this is the inside margin for your left page, and this is the right inside margin for your right page. but together the two make a gutter. And this is important because depending upon how you bind or fold your spread, you have to keep in mind how the gutter works together for the overall design. Some people will call your gutter an alley or a creep. So if you ever hear them referred to like that, know that they're talking about the gutter. Now, how do we know how to use grids in design? Well, you've probably seen this when you're working in a program like PowerPoint or Google Slides, even in Canva, if you've been playing around in there. We get these lines that come up that are called position or guidelines, and they help you place similar items at the same position on multiple layouts. And it helps you align things together. So you can see here, as I was working in Canva, I tried to screenshot, and we get this purple line that shows us where the exact middle of the design is. This becomes a position or guideline to tell me how to place this so it's in the direct center. You can also see the guidelines on the right hand of the page. When I'm trying to move the text, it's going to show me that the margins on each side of the text box are the exact same. So when you see those guidelines, they're really telling you how it aligns across the layout. Remember, your baseline grid is how the body of the text aligns across the layout. And so the baseline grid is how each line equals out on one another. A gutter, when we're talking about columns, are the space between columns. So when you have a column layout, make sure you know how wide you want the space between each column to be. Wider gutters allow you more white space on your page, while smaller gutters will allow you to put more content, but then they make your design look very busy. And then markers are different elements that would appear outside of your grid, such as page numbers or footnotes. So if you're working outside of your safe zone, but still placing things where they need to be, that's called a marker. Now, when we are using grids, it's important to remember how to space things evenly on the page. Your micro space is going to be the space that is between lines of text. On the left of your micro space, you can see that we have not given this paragraph much micro space, and therefore it looks very condensed and busy. On the right-hand side, we've allowed a little bit more micro space between the lines, which makes it easier to read and feels less cramped. Macro space is the amount of space between objects. And so here we are using white space and the background, which is white, effectively to let the entire design breathe and really show off a good bit of white space. And so that space between elements is called your macro space. Now, when we are using space, we sometimes think that the more elements we put on a design, the better it is, because it allows us to tell more of a story. But space should be considered part of your design, and so you want to use it effectively. Apple tends to do this very well with their very basic, simplistic use of white space, where it's really their brand, the information about when it might be available, learn more, pre-order, but really what you're drawn to is the product itself, making you want to purchase these items. And so the use of space really allows the simplistic nature of the design to shine. So not having a lot of macro space is not necessarily a bad thing. We do want to watch out for what's called trapped space, though. Trap space is any white space in your design that is trapped within elements. It's boxed in, and there is not a purpose to it being trapped. On the left-hand side, you can see that having the two butterflies meeting and then being blocked on the bottom by the text is creating white space between the elements. This creates an unattractive hole in the design, and it's actually what your eye will be drawn to more than the individual elements. If you want the flow and the organization of the design to sit better, then you need to use your space more effectively and ensure that there is no trap space between the elements. So you can see that they broke out the two butterflies so that trap space no longer exists. So make sure when you're looking at your design, you look out for any areas of potential trapped space. Now, visual flow is meant to direct the viewer through the layout. One of the main ways that you create visual flow is through the use of hierarchy. But you can also create visual flow from the way that you position elements on the page and use things like lines and rules and even white space to draw the eye to where you want it to go. On the left, you can see that all of the elements kind of look like they're getting sucked up, like a UFO would suck up, a human being into the spaceship. And the UFO here is the name of the festival. So it's kind of a clever use of directing the visual layout up. On the right-hand side, they are very direct about where they want you to look because they have a graphic element pointing to where they want you to check it out. This can be effective, although I would argue here that because my eye is immediately drawn to the pointing and the app store, it's not really giving me much information about the apps themselves. And so we lose a little bit of information because our eye is being drawn to the wrong place. So be very careful about where you draw the eye through visual flow. Another way to direct the viewer through your layout is to create what's called a secured area. And this is a purposeful use of trapping through different graphic elements to draw the eye to a particular thing. Where trap space creates an unintentional hole in your design, securing an area draws the attention there because it stands out as being trapped within the design. Here, the trapped area is the words geometric and try this. And so you can see that it's boxed in, it's the contrast between the black and the white and the different colors automatically draws your eye straight to the middle. So securing an area can be very helpful in terms of drawing the eye through the layout. Now, when we're using grids and really anytime we're designing, we need to think about the alignment of our elements. Now, we probably are familiar through word processor or even PowerPoint about how we can align text. But the idea of aligning text doesn't stop only with actual letters and typeface. Instead, we need to be thinking about the alignment of our overall design. So left align is obviously when you align all of your text and your elements to a left-hand side of the page. Centered is when they center out, and any short words are going to be still in the center, where longer words extend out farther on the left and right, but you can tell that everything is centered in the middle of the page. The right align is where your text and your elements are going to be right aligned. I would avoid right alignment as much as possible because we find it very difficult to read in Western countries because we read from left to right. And so a right alignment kind of breaks that. So unless you have an intentional use for right alignment, try to avoid it within your designs. Now, drawing visual connections is important as well. When we position our text and our different elements, we want them to work together. Your textbook provides some good explanations of this through use of rules or changing the direction of your font. Again, just make sure that any visual connections that you're making between elements make sense with one another. You don't want elements competing with one another. You don't want them to contrast too much to where they're distracting. So you're trying to find ways to connect your visual elements and make each of the individual elements stronger as a cohesive design. Now, in terms of using grids, it's important to know that while we use grids all the time, it's also okay as designers to break your grid. So, where a normal grid would have this columned or moduled out, where hate seeing plastic bottles on your beach would be one element, and then the visual would be further off on the right. What we've done here is bleed the two modules or columns together, thereby breaking the grid and breaking the design. It's actually somewhat of a surprising element to see the text go from the white space into the visual, which allows kind of a capturing of attention from your viewer. It makes the elements stronger together. But if, for instance, your text was the wrong color or the different elements didn't work together, then you would have to redesign so that they did work cohesively. So if you're going to break your grid, make sure you know what you're doing, why you're doing it, and that each individual element can work together through the rules of things like color theory, text, readability, visibility, etc. Now, the psychology behind grids is that grids allow our mind to organize and flow naturally through bits of information that are being shared. So, grids allow us to really simplify information rather than making the mind and the viewer work harder. And so, the more simple you can make your overall layout and design for someone to walk through, the better. It's also important to know, especially with the use of grids, that you can actually take out certain elements and the mind will naturally replace them. For instance, in the middle picture, you can see the word element, but you actually don't know that that's the word element because there is a line through it. But your mind will naturally fill in the blanks when you have missing elements. So sometimes you can use that to your benefit to draw attention purposefully to something that has been taken out. And so grids allow you to do that by breaking the natural flow of things and replacing something that may not actually be on the page. The mind will fill in the gap. Be careful with visual weights as well within grids because we always need to be cognizant of hierarchy, what we talked about in part one. Remember, visual weight can be created through things like color, movement, size and scale, variety, contrast, and empty spaces. So when you're thinking about your grid, make sure that it is simple, that it works in hierarchy, but know that you can also break it because the mind will naturally fill in your gaps. Symmetry is another important part of using grids and using effective layout and design. Symmetry means that two sides work in tandem with one another. So on this logo on the left, for instance, if I drew a line straight down the logo and folded up the logo as if it were if the two parts were touching, they work perfectly symmetrically with one another. The same here where we have symmetry all the way down the center. Now, it doesn't work necessarily with Happy Father's Day because the two sides are not the same, but because Happy Father's Day actually isn't symmetrical by the letters, it actually draws our attention to it more. But having symmetry in your design creates cohesion and allows it to work together. So symmetry is a great tool to use within layout. But asymmetry is actually just as effective when used properly. By breaking what the mind would naturally think of in terms of symmetry, you allow some direction to be built naturally. So, for instance, on the lanterns, if you wanted to have symmetry with this design, all the lanterns should be the same size. They, if you're using different colors, you would create a pattern where if you folded it, it would all be the same. Instead, the designer chose to use asymmetrical lines that are diagonal that then draw your eye from the title of the festival down to the additional information. So here, asymmetry is being used as a flow tool, but it's not so disorganized that your mind is confused. Same here. You have different breaking of the grid where things don't go where they naturally should, but there is still a natural flow that is created through the asymmetry. Now, your book talks about something called the golden ratio, and this actually is a very interesting, very scientific process that we see it across nature, across different design and structural elements that work together. If you're interested in this, Adobe Illustrator talks about using the golden ratio to create things like logos and other designs. As long as you know the basic concept of the golden ratio, that's okay. But also know that this is a pretty advanced concept and not something that you're probably going to think about very often within your design. But if you end up getting more into design and how you can work on layout and flow, I do highly suggest using this Illustrator tutorial if that's something that you're interested in. Now, if you have never used a grid before, know that a lot of systems such as Canva and Procreate and Illustrator will automatically have grid templates for you to use. So the great thing is that once you know the benefits of using grids, you can create them pretty easily through different design programs. So here's an example of how to do this in Canva.
Want to be inspired with your fonts, if you want to be inspired with your textures, and to help your inspiration run through the whole project and not lose sight of the project. That's the point of an inspiration board or mood board. You could also put a layout for yourself for Instagram. So just to visualize how the end of your Instagram layout is going to look like, a grid can help you nail that. So let's jump in on Canva and showcase how we can play around with grids and do this. Join me. We're going to start with a product grid, and you're going to go create your design so that you choose a canvas. We're going to work with a landscape flyer, and once it's open, we're going to click where it says elements, and we're going to scroll down to the bottom of the page until we find our grids. So you're going to click where it says see all, and then you would scroll down until you find the one grid that you want to work with. You can choose any one that you please, and you can just click on it once, and then it loads the grid like that. We're going to be working with a friend of mine, Joe Scritter from Zimbabwe, who designs Ankara clothes. So we're going to be using her products as an example and her brand. So you click on the picture once, you click and you hold, and you drag it to the grid itself. If you want to change where the photo is sitting, you just click on it once and you click where it says crop, and then you move it until you're happy with the way the photo is staged. Then you go and you find.
Notice when she moved that design that it created a grid even for that individual element. So you see grids all the time when you're designing.
Find the extra pictures that you want to load so that it showcases the products itself. I'll fast forward and add them and add the price, and then show you the end results just now. And there's your first grid done and dusted. As easy as that, showcasing.
So notice that she also used repetition to show the pricing for each of the designs. So a grid really allows you to have organization and elements, and it's very easy to do in a design program, just like you saw. Within this tutorial, if you want to go into the slides and continue to look, she also shows you how to create mood and inspiration boards using grids. And I think that that can be very helpful when you're beginning a design.
If you inspiration
So
that I needed
here's an example of a
and
more complicated grid that
something
you
in
can
the
use
house,
to
I
create a
added
mood
red,
board.
green.
So just different ways to use Canva to learn how to use grids and layouts. So now that you understand a little bit more about basic layout form, I want you to go into your discussion section and do the project and then critique your peers' layout and design. Please know that we are all at different levels of expertise here. And so don't feel like you are competing or comparing. Everybody should be getting both positive feedback, things that they're doing well, but also constructive feedback on things that they can do to improve, because no design is ever really going to be perfect. There are always ways to change or think about updating a design. So just keep that in mind as you begin some critiques of layout and design through these discussion boards. So that's going to be it for our first section that primarily looks at the big concepts of layout and design. So next week, you'll be reviewing for your midterm, which will be Friday, February 25th. The midterm will open up at 12:01 a.m. and close at 11:59 p.m. It is open all day long on Canvas. You are welcome to use your books, your notes, anything that will help you. No proctoring software is necessary because I'm really just wanting to make sure that you have a reinforcement of the concepts that we've talked about within lecture. You'll find a study guide at the beginning of week 7, and then you will have through all week um, until Friday, February 25th to prepare and study for that exam. I've provided you with an optional discussion board so that you can ask any questions about the exam you have. But also, if you don't want to ask those in a public forum, feel free to email me, set up office hours, or even swing by the office if you're on campus to talk to me about the midterm. I'm here to help if you need me. I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I will see you after the midterm.